Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our today's lecture is on post-colonial perspectives in translation. This is our fifth lecture in translation studies. The post-colonial approach to translation studies with Spivak, Niranjana, Susan Basnet and Trivedi as the advocate began to analyze the asymmetrical power relations in the post-colonial context. The linking of colonization and translation is accompanied by the argument that translation has played an active role in the colonization process and in propagating an ideologically motivated image of the colonized people. Niranjana, in her book Sitting Translation, discusses the inequalities between languages, cultural domination, and manipulative power of translation, which sheds light on the role of translation in establishing representation of the colonial subject with the post-colonial context. According to them, translation has long been a site for perpetuating the unequal power relations among peoples, races, and languages. The different approaches within the cultural perspectives widen the scope of translation studies and propelled it to a higher status and prosper in 1990s. In 1990, Susan Basnet and Andre Lefebvre they famously announced what had been underway for some time, the culture turn in translation studies. So they imagined that neither the word nor the text but the culture becomes the operational unit of translation. The collection in which their work appeared has recently been hailed by Advan Janser, one of the leading synthesizers of translation theory, as the real breakthrough. He called it a real breakthrough for the field of translation studies, which is true in the sense that it epitomized what is sometimes termed the coming of age of the discipline. As important representative of cultural approach in translation studies, Basnet and Lefebvre attached great importance to the role of culture in translation, the social background, the influence that cultural tradition imposed on translation, the subjectivity of translators, and researching shift from linguistic to culture, thus improving the literariness of translated text. But before that turn, there was a linguistic turn. Actually, translation was based on the linguistic elements, but now it shifted to culture, and culture becomes the central point of translation. Such method of study expanded the scope of translation studies enormously, opened a new field of study, and thus it enhanced a further and more comprehensive development of translation studies. Combined with widespread cultural studies in 1980s, translation studies shifts to focus on the cultural differences between texts and the reception and influence of translated text on the target culture. As the cultural turn has held sway in translation studies, translators then functioned as a mediator with subjectivity or somewhat power of manipulation. Till the end of 20th century, deconstruction and cultural studies which began to be more politically assertive and discusses the issues like ethnics, races, imperialisms, etc., had a larger impact upon translators and translation theorists in the area of post-colonial translation. Translation studies then looks into the power relation between different cultures, especially the conflicts and resistance between strong and weak cultures in terms of political and ideological constraints. With the accumulating studies on power, post-colonial perspectives in translation studies challenge the traditional normalized concepts about translating. Therefore, during the first years in 21st century, post-colonial perspectives have established a power turn in translation studies. The source and target cultures are conceived as substantially different but equal cultural systems. The systems that nevertheless have more or less the same power to shape and control the translator's work to suit target cultural needs. Therefore, in terms of political sense and power discourse between ethnical based cultures, they are in no way comparable to the post colonial perspectives in translation studies. Another important feature of post colonial studies is their interest in hybridity. The hybridity that concerns translation studies belongs to our tradition of debate having to do with plurilingualism and linguistic realization, notions of transculturalism and transtextualization, as well as aspects of diasporic cultural expression that include bilingualism and double consciousness. While these ideas of cultural mixing have become especially prominent since the advent of post-colonial theory in the last decades of 20th century, it is mistaken to assume that the hybridity is a new feature of cultural life. There are strong affinities between the process of translation and the creation of a cultural or linguistic hybrid. A translation carries aspects of one text into the materiality of another, so any translated text could be considered a hybrid that results from the interpenetration of two language systems. However, because the translated text does not necessarily carry the marks of the process through which it came into being, it often, but not always, looks like a product of the target language. Because when you see at the translated text, so you don't feel, it's not necessary that you realize the marks of process, the procedure through which it came into being. So you just see the final product, and it often, not always, it looks like the product of the target language if the translation is of good quality. It's not affected by the mother tongue of the translator. So then, you feel it as a product of the translated text language, translated language. Hybridity should therefore be reserved to describe only certain kinds of translations, those that draw attention to themselves as the products of two separate meaning systems. So hybrid texts are those that display translation effects, dissonances, interferences, disparate vocabulary, a lack of cohesion, unconventional syntax, a certain weakness or deterioration deterritorialization. So if we see these characteristics, then we consider those texts as hybrid texts. But if we do not realize any effect of any external effect to that text, so then we may not take it as hybrid text. So the mixing can be expressed either at the level of linguistic codes. So mixing can be the level of linguistic codes, or more broadly at the level of cultural or historical references. So this mixing can be expressed at linguistic level or cultural level. While the hybrid text affirms the dividedness of identity, often becoming an expression of loss and disorientation, it can also become a powerful and emancipatory place for the writer to occupy. Translation offers a model of hybrid textuality when it bears the marks of the relation that brought it into existence. This highlighting of relationality supports Walter Benjamin's idea that translation does not erase language difference but exposes the spaces where meaning systems collide. The translated text can be understood as a contact zone, a third space which is an overlapping of cultures that can generate borderline effects and identifications. For Homi Bhabha, he is an Indian scholar, following Walter Benjamin, the third space or space between must be understood. So third space or space between, these are two different terms that you can feel or realize or see in hybrid text. They must be understood not as a separate alternative space but as an arena of active and ongoing differences whose meanings are always in flux. The hybrid text can be understood then as a translation that is, according to the norms of conventional language transfer, deliberately unfinished. Post-colonial translation studies takes an overlook on this in-between space or cultural borders suggested by Homi Bhabha in his The Location of Culture, and explores the hybridity in the text between asymmetrical cultures. It is such hybridity through which the former colonial intellectuals can accomplish the relocation and reconstruction of their ethnical based cultural identity. So here we have another pillar of post colonial theory, Spivak in short. Spivak is one of the influential critics who is related to post-colonialism, feminism, deconstruction and Marxism. She was follower of Derrida and his translators. She is the author of Translator's Preface of Derrida's of Grammatology. She is interested in seeing how truth is constructed rather than in exposing error. Fundamental to Spivak's theory is the concept of subaltern. The subaltern is a military term which means of lower rank. She borrowed this term from Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. In her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, shows the earliest political historiography shifted the voice of the subaltern group, women, tribal people, or third world or Orient. They are all considered as lower group. She is known for her best known essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, In this essay, she exposes the irony that the subalterns have awakened to consciousness of their own rights by making practical utterances against unjust domination and inequality. She attacks the Eurocentric attitude of West. She holds that knowledge is never innocent. It's always operated by Western economical interest and power. For Spivak, knowledge is like any other commodity or product that is exported from the West to the Third World. The Western scholars have always presented themselves and their knowledge about the Eastern cultures as objective. The knowledge about the Third World is always constructed with the political and economical interest of the West. Spivak criticizes Foucault, other critics, accusing them in cooperating with capitalism and imperialism. Spivak joins Edward Said in order to criticize the way in which Western writers have represented the Third World, Subaltern, in their academic discourse. Spivak's concept of worlding. Spivak rejects the idea that there is a pre-colonial past that we can recover. She rejects this idea. A nostalgia of lost origin, roots and native culture is flawed project because there is no pure pre-colonial past to recover. It has been changed by colonialism. So she rejects this idea that we had our own culture in past and we can recover it. So she said that it's been changed by colonialism and there is nothing to go back to. What we can do is only understand the wording of the Third World. So how wording is a process through which the local population was persuaded to accept the European version of reality for understanding their social world. So how the Third World was let's say shown to the third world people by the West. This is what is Spivak's concept of wording. Post-colonial perspectives in translation studies are an applied model and research paradigm of post-colonial criticism in the circle of translation. Post-colonial translating practitioners and theorists are seeking to reclaim translation and use it as a strategy to resist to the conceptual system based on Western philosophy and religion. They look into the power, relation, and operation implied in the disturbance and displacement of the translated text. It is preconditioned by the fact that, historically speaking, cultures have never been equal. Further, it denies the utopian theoretical hypothesis of linguistic and cultural equality in translating, thus consequently opposes to the ideal purpose of semantic equivalence in translating. Post-colonial perspectives provide an external observation supplementary to the internal textual analysis in translation studies. Starting from the fact of cultural asymmetry, they take the occurring context of translating and translations as objects and consider the issues on how to select the original text, the translating strategies, and the influence and reception of the translations in the target culture. Among these issues, the political, ethnical, racial, and imperialistic factors are regarded as the decisive external elements on translating activities. The questions that post-colonial raise The important questions according to Simon are here. We have what are the roles that translations play with the colonial and post-colonial context? Do they serve only to impose an alien and oppressive presence on a foreign culture, or are they part of a process of exchange which involves an active chain of response, a vivifying interaction? So it's self-evident, it's clear that the central intersection of translation studies and post-colonial criticism is that of power relations. Since many translation scholars are concerned in many different ways with both theories and practices of translation in post-colonial context, post-colonial translation studies takes many forms. Some are based on some forms of colonial translation are based on the theory and practice of translation from an Indian perspective. For example, we have a list here. Some take the relation of Irish literature as the subject, and still some projects entailing the exploration and celebration of the hybridity, both cultural and linguistic. So some are focusing on the hybridity, both type of hybridity, cultural hybridity and linguistic hybridity. Apart from this methodological significance in translation studies, post-colonial translation studies holds that translation is the battleground and exemplification of the post-colonial context, which is inevitably related to the ethnical based cultural identity. As a literal and cultural criticism, post-colonial theories sprang up shoots in Western academia as a practicing model of cultural analysis. However, it has been applied more to cultural texts from non-Western nations. Generally speaking, most of the practicing materials come from the local texts in former colonial nations translated into ex-colonizer cultures. Such new sites on textual studies revealed the hegemonic violence in translation, thus give an exposure to the epistemological crisis, the negative images constructed via translation upon the psyche and character of target population. Such crises have always been calling for former colonial intellectuals' consciousness to their ethnical based cultural identity. The final word here about the discussion: post-colonial translation studies has covered a wide variety of geographical and cultural texts which use translation as a lens through which we can define and assess the dynamics of post-colonialism, as well as demarginalize the voices of minorities. Thank you very much. We have here the assignment for this topic. So this is just a brief touch to the topic in the lecture today. Here you write a note on the important characteristics of post-colonial theories of translation. So you will just gather about especially the three people mentioned in the first slide. So anything you collect from those three writers, so you will include your assignment. Thank you very much. See you soon, inshallah.